Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi there, Herman and Corin. So we've had some episodes talking about remote work, and I think the promise of remote work is really great, in the sense that it says talent is distributed around the world, and if you're working in a knowledge-based company, and that's an important thing I think to talk about or to bear in mind when we're having this debate about remote work. It's easy to fall under the forget that not all work, this isn't even on the table for a lot of jobs. We're talking about a specific subset of jobs that might be remote friendly, right? We can't have, at the moment at least, a remote crane operator or a remote cleaner. So there's certain things that across all industries, it's just not an option. But for those where it is an option, we've talked about how the potential for remote work is often limited in practice by jurisdictional requirements, like that the employee has to be within a time zone or within a certain jurisdiction. And we've talked about why those are in place. And I've shared the view that I think it's a big limiting factor for the viability of remote work, and the lack of in-person culture and socialization. And there's a lot of things to be said against it that have been criticized, and justifiably. One other aspect that I think when we talk about how is this going to work in practice is when you have people in very different wage bases, or team members in countries with very different cost of living. There's this concept called geographical arbitrage, in which somebody can choose to live in a country with a low cost of living and work remotely with a company based in somewhere with a high cost of living. And that opens besides the jurisdictional aspects, which we talked about in that other episode, this opens up, I think, a lot of questions about just fairness and HR questions. Is it reasonable that person should be compensated at the general rate of pay for the company, even though in practice that person's real income is going to be a multiple of somebody based in the head office? And I think if you look at that on the flip side, and if we're going to tie rates of pay to the location in which a remote worker is based, then we're going to see real, very significant pay differentials across a common level of experience based upon where the person is based. And I think that there's probably a concern from companies about that aspect as well, that they might not want to be seen, or that they are paying unequal wages for similar labor. So Herman and Corin, the remote work thing has been in progress for a number of years, and I've seen more than one person, and I even know a couple of people who've kind of done their own versions of geographical arbitrage. And I'm just wondering how that debate has unfolded and been received in HR, and what kind of consensus has emerged, and how are different companies handling this question. Over to you, Herman and Corin.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. We are coming to you from Jerusalem, and it is a beautiful, crisp afternoon here in the German colony. The sun is hitting the stone buildings just right, and honestly, it is the perfect backdrop for a conversation about where we choose to plant our roots. I am Corn, and I am joined as always by my brother,
Herman Poppleberry, reporting for duty. I have been looking forward to this one since we heard the recording this morning. It is one of those topics that feels like it is constantly evolving, especially as we settle into the mid-20s.
Yeah, our housemate Daniel sent us a voice memo with a topic that hits close to home for a lot of people these days. He was asking about geographical arbitrage. Basically, the idea of living in a low cost of living area while pulling in a high cost of living salary. It is a debate that has been simmering in the human resources world for a few years now, but as of February 2026, it feels like we are finally starting to see some real consensus, or at least some very clear, very jagged battle lines being drawn.
It is a fascinating intersection of economics, ethics, and corporate strategy. Daniel mentioned the promise of remote work, that talent is distributed globally, and he is right. But the practical application of that has turned into a massive headache for payroll departments and tax authorities alike. We are talking about billions of dollars in potential savings for companies versus the lifestyle expectations of workers who want to have their cake and eat it too.
It is such a polarizing issue. On one hand, you have the equal pay for equal work argument. If I am writing the same lines of code or closing the same sales deals as someone sitting in a high-rise in Manhattan, why should I be paid less just because I decided to move to a beach in Greece or a small town in the Midwest? On the other hand, companies argue that compensation is tied to the local labor market.
Exactly. And that is the core tension. Is salary a reward for the value you produce, or is it a reflection of what it costs to sustain your life and remain competitive in your local area? We have reached episode 518 now, and we have touched on remote work before, but we have never really gone deep into the actual mechanisms of how HR departments are settling this in 2026.
I think a good place to start is defining the term itself. Geographical arbitrage sounds like some high-level finance term, but in this context it is pretty straightforward. Herman, how would you break down the mechanics for someone who has heard the term but is not sure how it actually plays out in a contract?
Sure. So, arbitrage in finance is basically buying something in one market and selling it in another to profit from the price difference. In the labor market, geographical arbitrage happens when an employee takes their high-value skills, which are priced at global or high-density hub rates, and applies them while living in a market where their expenses are significantly lower. If you earn $200,000 a year working for a tech firm in San Francisco, you are doing okay, but you are likely spending $5,000 a month on a modest apartment. If you take that same $200,000 salary and move to, say, Lisbon or even just a smaller city like Indianapolis, your purchasing power effectively doubles or triples. You are essentially profiting from the mismatch between your income source and your expense location.
And for a while, especially during your early 20s, it felt like the Wild West. People were moving all over the place without telling their bosses, or they were taking advantage of the fact that companies had not updated their policies yet. But fast forward to now, and the landscape is much more structured. The debate in HR has moved past the initial shock and into a very technical phase. What is the actual consensus that has emerged over the last year or two?
It is not a single consensus, but rather three distinct models that have become the standard. The most common one, used by the majority of large corporations, is the localized pay model. This is what companies like Google, Microsoft, and Meta eventually settled on after a lot of trial and error. They have these incredibly complex pay scales based on tiers. If you live in a Tier 1 city like New York, London, or Zurich, you get the top of the bracket. If you move to a Tier 3 city, they might cut your base pay by 15, 20, or even 25%.
I remember when that first started happening. There was a huge outcry. People called it a pay cut for doing the same job, but the HR justification was that they were paying for the cost of labor, not the cost of living. That is a distinction I think we should dig into, because it sounds like corporate doublespeak, but there is an economic logic to it that, Herman, I know you have some thoughts on.
It is a very important distinction. Cost of living is how much it costs to buy a gallon of milk and rent a 2-bedroom house. Cost of labor is what you have to pay to hire someone with a specific skill set in a specific location. HR professionals argue that if they pay a software engineer in Omaha the same salary as one in San Francisco, they are actually overpaying relative to the local market. They are essentially distorting the local economy and making it impossible for local Omaha companies to compete for talent. It creates a sort of economic gravity well where one company can suck up all the local talent just because they are using a different yardstick.
But wait, if the market for that engineer is global, then the local Omaha market should not matter, right? If that engineer can get a job anywhere in the world from their laptop, then their market value is the global rate, not the local rate. That is the counter-argument I hear most often from the digital nomad community.
And that is exactly where the friction is. Proponents of the global rate model, which is the second major model we see, argue exactly that. Companies like Airbnb or Reddit famously said they would not adjust pay based on location within the United States. Their philosophy is that talent is the commodity and the location is irrelevant. They want the best people, and they are willing to pay a flat, high rate to get them, regardless of where they sit. They see it as a competitive advantage. If they pay San Francisco rates to someone in a small town, that person is never going to leave. You get incredible loyalty and retention.
That seems much fairer to the employee, but I imagine it creates a different kind of problem for HR. If everyone is on a flat rate, but some people are living in expensive cities and others are living in cheap ones, you end up with a massive disparity in lifestyle among people on the same team.
Right? You have two senior designers. One is struggling to save for a down payment in London, and the other is living like a king in Bali with a private chef and a villa. That can actually create a lot of internal resentment and friction. It is the inverse of the unfairness argument. The person in the expensive city feels like they are being punished for living near the office or staying in a cultural hub. They feel like they are subsidizing their colleagues' luxury lifestyle. In 2025, we saw several high-profile cases of internal pay equity lawsuits, where employees in high-cost cities argued that their real income was lower than their remote peers.
So we have the localized pay model and the flat rate model. What is the third one?
The third one is what I call the regional or zone-based model. This is a bit of a middle ground. Instead of tracking every single zip code, which is an administrative nightmare, a company might have 3 zones for an entire country or even an entire continent. Zone A is the high-cost hubs, Zone B is mid-sized cities, and Zone C is everywhere else. This reduces the administrative burden on HR while still acknowledging that there are massive differences in economic reality between, say, Zurich and rural Poland. It is a compromise that tries to please everyone but often leaves everyone slightly annoyed.
I find the administrative part of this fascinating, because even if a company wants to allow geographical arbitrage, they run into the jurisdictional nightmare that Daniel mentioned in his prompt. We talked about this in an earlier episode, but it has only gotten more complex as governments have caught up. Even if the company does not care where you live, the tax authorities definitely do.
Oh, the tax implications are the real reason many companies are forced to be strict. If you are a United States company and you have an employee move to Spain, you suddenly have what is called a permanent establishment in Spain. You might be liable for Spanish corporate taxes, social security contributions, and you have to comply with Spanish labor laws, which are very different from United States laws. Think about severance pay, vacation time, and health insurance. This is why we have seen the massive rise of what are called employers of record, or EORs. Companies like Deal or Remote have basically turned geographical arbitrage into a service. They hire the person on your behalf in their local country, handle the local taxes and compliance, and then bill you a fee.
It is basically outsourcing the legal headache of remote work. But even with those services, the question of the pay rate remains. I saw a report recently that said about 60% of remote-first companies now use some form of location-based adjustment. So it seems like the localized pay model is winning out, even if employees hate it.
It is winning because it is the most defensible from a purely financial perspective. If a company can save $30 million a year by adjusting salaries for people who move to lower-cost areas, it is very hard for a chief financial officer to say no to that. But there is a hidden cost, which is the talent drain. We are starting to see the best of the best, the top 1% of talent, refusing to accept localized pay. They know their value is global, and they will only work for the companies that offer the flat high rate.
So we might be heading toward a tiered system of companies, rather than just tiered pay within companies. The elite firms pay the global rate and get the absolute best talent, while the more traditional firms use localized pay and get the people who prioritize staying in their hometown or living a specific lifestyle over maximizing their raw salary.
That is exactly what is happening. It is a market segmentation, and it is not just about the money, it is about the culture. If you are a company that pays a flat rate, you are signaling that you are truly borderless. You are telling your employees that you trust them and value their output above all else. If you are a company that tracks their location and adjusts their pay every time they move, you are signaling a more traditional, surveillance-based relationship. It suggests that you are buying their time and their presence, even if that presence is digital.
I want to push back on the fairness aspect for a second. Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine you're an HR manager. You have a budget of $1 million for a 5-person team. Do you hire 5 people in high-cost cities at 200,000 each? Or do you hire 10 people in low-cost areas at 100,000 each? If the output is the same, the choice seems obvious. But if you pay the 10 people 100,000, are you exploiting them?
That is the big ethical question. Some people call it digital colonialism. You are taking the economic power of a wealthy nation or city and using it to buy labor in a poorer area at a discount. But the flip side is that $100,000 in a low-cost area might be 5 times the local average wage. You are providing a life-changing opportunity for that worker. Is it exploitation to pay someone 5 times the local rate, even if it is half of what you would pay in San Francisco? Most workers in those regions would say no. They see it as a massive win.
It feels like it depends on your perspective. From the workers' perspective, they are often thrilled. They get to stay near their family, contribute to their local economy, and have a much higher standard of living than their peers. But from the perspective of their coworker in San Francisco, it feels like the company is just looking for ways to undercut wages. It creates this race to the bottom where the San Francisco rate eventually disappears because the company realizes they can get the same work for half the price elsewhere.
And there is a second-order effect here that we have to talk about, which is the impact on the destination cities. We are seeing this in places like Mexico City, Lisbon, and Medellin. When a wave of remote workers moves in with their high, even if slightly adjusted, salaries, they drive up the local rents. They change the character of neighborhoods. The local residents who are earning local wages get priced out. So geographical arbitrage is not just a private matter between an employee and an employer. It has massive social consequences for the places these people are moving to.
That is such a great point. It is basically gentrification on a global scale. We are seeing these digital nomad enclaves where the cost of a coffee or a meal starts to match New York prices, while the local infrastructure and the rest of the population are still operating on a completely different economic plane. I read that in Lisbon, the average rent has increased by over 30% in just the last 2 years, largely attributed to the influx of remote workers.
There was actually a fascinating study out of Portugal recently that looked at this. They found that while remote workers brought in tax revenue and spent money in local shops, the rapid increase in housing costs outweighed the benefits for the bottom 60% of the local population. This has led to a political backlash. We are seeing some countries scaling back their digital nomad visas or adding requirements that these workers must be paid a certain amount above the local median. Some are even implementing nomad taxes to fund local housing projects.
So the consensus in HR is also being shaped by the consensus in local governments. It is not just about what the company wants to do, but what the host country will allow. I am curious, Herman, in your research, have you seen any companies that have found a truly creative way to handle this? Something beyond just cutting pay or keeping it flat?
There are a few outliers. Some companies have moved to a value-based bonus system. They pay a base salary that is localized to ensure everyone has a comfortable standard of living, but then they have a very aggressive bonus structure based purely on performance and output. This way, the high performers can still earn that global rate through their bonuses, regardless of where they live, but the company's fixed costs are managed through the localized base pay. It shifts the risk to the employee, but also the reward.
That sounds like a reasonable middle ground. It rewards the value creation while acknowledging the economic reality of the location, but it requires a very robust way of measuring output, which is notoriously difficult in knowledge work. It is easy to measure how many widgets a factory worker makes, but how do you measure the value of a senior manager's strategic thinking or a developer's clean code?
That is the holy grail of HR right now. Performance management systems that are objective enough to justify pay disparities. Without that, you fall back on these blunt instruments like cost of living indexes. I should mention, for our listeners who are navigating this right now, there is a very useful tool called the GitLab Compensation Calculator. It is public, and it is what a lot of other companies have modeled their systems after. You can plug in your role, your experience level, and your city, and it will tell you exactly what the pay would be. It is incredibly transparent, which helps mitigate the feeling of unfairness because at least you know the rules of the game before you sign up.
Transparency seems to be the key. The worst situations are where the company has a secret policy, or they negotiate on a case-by-case basis. That is where the resentment really boils over. If I find out my colleague moved to a cheaper city and kept their full salary while I'm here in an expensive city, and we are both at the same level, I'm going to be looking for the exit. It destroys the trust.
Exactly. Discretionary arbitrage is a recipe for a toxic culture. The companies that are succeeding in this remote-first world are the ones that have a clear, published formula. Whether that formula is flat pay or localized pay, the important part is that it is applied equally to everyone. No special deals for the favorites.
I also wonder about the long-term career implications of geographical arbitrage. If you move away from the hub to a low-cost area, are you more likely to be passed over for promotions? Even in a remote-first company, is there a proximity bias that favors the people who are in the same time zone as the leadership, or who can occasionally drop into the office?
The data on that is still coming in, but the early signs from 2024 and 2025 suggest that proximity bias is very real. There is a concept called the career penalty for remote work. If you are not in the room where it happens, even if that room is a virtual one, you miss out on the informal networking and the serendipitous conversations that often lead to new opportunities. Some companies are trying to combat this by requiring leaders to be remote as well, to level the playing field. If the chief executive officer is working from a ranch in Montana, it is much harder to justify a proximity bias for the headquarters in San Francisco.
That is a great strategy. Lead from the front, or in this case, lead from the remote location. I want to shift gears slightly and talk about the practical takeaways for our listeners. If you are someone who is looking to leverage geographical arbitrage, or if you are an employer trying to set a policy, what are the key things you should be thinking about right now?
For employees, the first thing is to do your homework on the tax and legal side. Do not just assume you can move and keep everything the same. Check if your company has a presence in the new location or if they use an employer of record, and be prepared for the pay negotiation. If you are moving to a lower cost area, you should have a clear argument for why your value to the company has not changed. Focus on your output, your reliability, and your contribution to the team culture.
And maybe do not lead with how much money you are going to save on rent.
Right. That is a personal benefit, not a business justification. Focus on the business. For employers, the takeaway is that you need a policy yesterday. If you do not have a clear, transparent framework for how you handle location-based pay, you are going to lose your best people to the companies that do. And consider the impact on your culture. Are you building a team of mercenaries who are just looking for the highest purchasing power? Or are you building a community of people who are aligned with your mission?
It is a delicate balance. I think we are going to see a lot more experimentation with this as the technology for remote collaboration continues to improve. We are already seeing some very interesting virtual reality office setups that aim to reduce that proximity bias we were talking about. If everyone is an avatar in a digital space, it does not matter if your physical body is in Tokyo or Topeka.
Oh, absolutely. The more we can make the remote experience feel like being in the same room, the less the physical location matters for the work itself, but the economic reality of the physical location will always be there. You still have to pay for your house and your food in the physical world. And as long as those costs vary wildly across the globe, geographical arbitrage will remain one of the most contentious issues in the modern workplace.
This has been a really deep dive. I feel like I understand the HR perspective much better now. It is not just about companies being stingy. It is about them trying to navigate a massive shift in how labor is priced and regulated across borders. It is a transition from a world where labor was tied to land to a world where labor is tied to a network.
Precisely. That kind of shift takes decades to fully resolve. We are right in the middle of the messy part. We are redefining the social contract between employer and employee in real time.
Well, I hope this helped answer some of Daniel's questions. It is a topic that is only going to get more relevant as the line between our physical and digital lives continues to blur. If you are enjoying these deep dives, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps the show reach new people and allows us to keep exploring these weird prompts.
Yeah, it really does make a difference. We love hearing from you, and those reviews are the best way to support the work we do here. It keeps the lights on and the research going.
You can find all our past episodes, including the ones we mentioned today about remote work and jurisdictional hurdles, at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We have a full archive there and an RSS feed if you want to subscribe.
And if you have your own weird prompt or a question you want us to tackle, there is a contact form on the site as well. We are always looking for new ideas to dig into, no matter how niche or technical they might be.
Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry. We will see you next time.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.